Hello, Year 13. I'm here to give you some feedback on the passage which you recently completed in your mock examination. But before I start, I just want to have a little disclaimer. There is no kind of facsimile or template for an exam answer. We as examiners do not have a list of things that we look for, so the things that I'm going to be talking about today are the things that I find. It may be that your response was completely different, but it's still completely legitimate to have different interpretations. English is not science, fortunately. We do not have correct answers. Now, to start off, analysing the question is really important. So we've always been looking at the significance of dramatic tragedy, and we look at the passage down below, and then we look at the play as a whole. So as you know, you are doing very close reading of the passage, and then you're doing some lateral thinking and finding links. And links are not only about similarity, they can also be about difference. So you're going to link to other parts of the play which illuminate this particular passage with a particular focus on tragedy. And I always say to my classes that one of the things that examiners are looking for is that you understand the architecture of the play, how it's structured and put together. What is the tragic arc of the play? So as I talk through this passage now, I'll also occasionally pause to show links that occur to me. So to begin with, we know that our passage is from Act 3, Scene 4. But it's always good to know the text really well. And if you know this scene, you will know that Othello has just dismissed Desdemona, and we've had his violent speech about the handkerchief in which he reminds her of his Oriental origins and of his cultural otherness. So that's the actual setting for the passage. Now we know that Iago was completely instrumental in raising Othello's rage. And now we see him in his public persona. So there are two Othellos, and you might want to comment on that right away. There's the Othello in private, who is nasty, who's vindictive, who's energetic and manipulative. And then there is a completely different Iago with a public face, who's seen as an affable soldier, who's seen in particular, and I'll go on to say more about this, as the most honest of men. And our scene begins showing the brilliant timing of Iago, who is our kind of vice figure. And in terms of tragedy and tragic fate, everything goes Iago's way. The timing of this is absolutely perfect. He's just managed to get Othello off stage. Now he can set up another meeting between Desdemona and Cassio so that they seem guilty once again. So we know that he takes great joy in his artistry and that he sees himself as a kind of puppet master. Now, in terms of the tragedy, what intensifies the tragedy is the fact that he seems to have almost supernatural abilities, and that tragic fate seems to work against many of the characters and seems to work to Iago's advantage. And so he is one of the most formidable antagonists in literature, often written about instead of Othello. Many critics choose to write about Iago because he is such a remarkable villain, antagonist, and so different from the archetypes that we see elsewhere, even in some of Shakespeare's plays. Now, immediately we see the goodness of Desdemona, and that's something that I would very much emphasize in my piece. Desdemona's virtue, her spotless character, is essential to the tragedy, and we see it here in very fine relief. Immediately, Cassio does just as Iago asks. He importunes her, he stops her, and he uses his extravagant, poetic, and manipulative language. He says, "I beseech you." So he puts himself at her mercy. He talks about the office of my heart entirely honor. So here he shows a kind of desperation to get back into Othello's good books. And then he uses a number of metaphors which are very clever because they're there to provoke pity and sympathy in Desdemona. He talks about himself as a ransom. So here he's characterizing himself as a kind of hostage, and that, again, it's emphasizing his vulnerability and his powerlessness. At the end of the speech, he says, "And shut myself up in some other course to fortune's arms." Now, arms here mean charity. So he's kind of presenting himself as a beggar or a pauper. And this shows just how eloquent he is. Now, Desdemona, of course, in terms of performance, would be visibly upset. We know that she's a woman who wants to have a reconciliation between them. We know that Iago will use that virtue to his advantage. And so in terms of the acting here, and it's very important that students visualize the play on the stage, Desdemona would be very upset. She's also in a state of terrible conflict. She's seen Othello's rage. She's just listened to him discussing the Egyptian Sibyl who wove the handkerchief from mummies' hearts. So she has all of those images of terror in her mind, but at the same time, she feels a duty to help Cassio. So she's in a terrible quandary in this particular speech, and it's important that you recognize that. She does, however, for the first time, have a kind of inkling that Othello is deeply troubled. We saw earlier that she has an incredible belief in Othello. I think one of the key quotes, and one that I think would be very good to link here, is where she says, "I think the son where he was born drew all such humours from him." And this, of course, is in reference to jealousy. When Emilia asks her if Othello is jealous, she immediately dismisses it. She has an extraordinary and idealized version of Othello that seem to go back to his extraordinary stories of the Anthropophagi and of his travels. And here we see just what a difficult situation she's in, because she says, "As I have spoken for you all my best, and stood within the blank of his displeasure." Now, many of you may not know what this means. Blank, actually, in Jacobean times meant target. So literally, she's saying she would place herself in the firing line. But interestingly, she chooses not to speak to Othello this time about Cassio, because she does have a kind of growing awareness of what is occurring. It's a dim awareness, but it is growing quickly. Now, I think a nice, interesting place to link this to in the rest of the play is the maid Barbara and the willow song. Because by the end, just before her death in the bed scene, she says, "Her salt tears fell from her and softened the stones." So this is a quote taken from the willow song, and the willow song is emblematic of a woman who's been betrayed by a man. So I think it's kind of important to understand that this is the beginning of Desdemona understanding that something is afoot and that it is very, very dangerous. And that fits in with the tragedy because it's part of the dramatic irony. The audience are fully aware of the danger she's in. She only has a dim awareness of it. So whenever we watch these scenes, we watch them with grave concern for Desdemona. As I'll go on to talk about in a moment, many members of the audience in Jacobean times and later fainted when Desdemona was killed. And I think this is one of the scenes that helps to establish her as a woman of spotless honor and virtue, who loves her husband unconditionally and refuses to really entertain the idea that he has faults. And now, right, on to the second page then, okay? Now it's interesting because Desdemona ends her speech with these words, "Let that suffice you." So in other words, she's telling Cassio that she's not going to go and intervene on his behalf at that moment, that he needs patience. You can almost feel the audience give a sigh of relief, because we, the audience, understand how damaging that would be. We're in possession of the plot, and that's what makes the drama so effective. That's something to comment on in terms of the structure. And now we see Iago at his best. Great tragedies often have a remarkable antagonist, and as I've said, Iago is certainly that. He's an amazingly theatrical character, and here we see that he's a consummate actor and performer. For those of you who want to talk about meta-theatre and that this is a play about theatre, it's not a bad idea to do so. Alternatively, you can talk about the theme of appearance and reality, which is a very strong theme in this particular scene. So Iago says, "Is my lord angry?" And the audience might almost have a kind of grudging admiration for him because he's such a consummate performer. And this is a wonderful example. There are many examples that you could link to elsewhere in the play. What I thought might be worth linking to here is the critic William Empson, who wrote a brilliant essay called Honest in Iago. And he was the first person to point out that Iago is referred to as honest over 50 times. I believe it's 52 times. So there's an extraordinary concentration on this word, and it's used when the term is being misapplied. And that's the remarkable thing. And it's worth the audience remembering, within the play world, within the diegesis, Iago is considered a man of blunt honesty, a man to be relied upon. And that's what's so remarkable. Now, in terms of linking that later, or earlier rather, to a moment in the play, perhaps when Iago speaks of reputation is an idle and false imposition, those words again are filled with such dramatic irony. The character that he speaks them to, Cassio, does not understand how important they are. But we, the audience, understand just how important those words are. And part of the tragedy is the fact that the characters are unable to see what we grasp. And that creates the enormous amounts of tension. So the audience sit in a state of tension because they watch paralyzed as the characters are undone by this ingenious actor. And notice here again, Iago. Can he be angry? And is he angry? He's incredulous. Now let's not forget, in the previous scene, he has goaded Othello into an absolute rage. He has provided him with the ocular proof, the handkerchief that he sought. He is fully aware of the rage that Othello's in. But here, once again, we see that he is superb. And what's really interesting is he chooses this moment to have an extraordinary speech of praise. I'd said it's almost like a blazon in the sonnet, when you praise a character for their incredible beauty or virtue or their singing voice, etc. And here, Iago gives him this tribute, reminding us that Othello is a great martial figure, a great soldier and a warrior. So he chooses this time. And again, the dramatic irony is incredible, because we, the audience, have been watching Othello being undone, and now we are reminded of the former Othello by the very man who wants to destroy him. And Desdemona is kind of relieved by this. She says, "I prithee do so." Now notice, exit Iago. Iago's exits are well-timed, just like his entrance earlier was well-timed. It's all about the consummate skill of his plan or his plot, his net, his web, his bird line, all of those image clusters that he uses to describe his incredible plot, okay? And we see once again Desdemona's very pure, spotless nature. Now, from a modern feminist perspective, we would see this as a fault. We would see this as the fact that she has given no kind of introduction to the world. She has no worldly knowledge. She can't read men. She's been kept captive by her father. And that really is visible here, because in the scenes between Desdemona and Emilia, and it would be worth discussing them in your essay, we see that Emilia has far more worldly knowledge, far more street smart than than Desdemona does, okay? And once again, Desdemona tries to see the best in Othello, just as we saw earlier. She says, "Maybe some bad news hath puddled his clear spirit." So once again, she has seen him in terms of pureness, clearness, etc. Iago has always seen him in terms of blackness, dirtiness, and using what you could call pollution effects. She, on the other hand, idolizes him and sees him in this clear way. So that's definitely a kind of phrase that you might want to swag. We've seen this pattern that she constantly wishes to support Othello in his career. We saw it in Act 1, Scene 3 in the trial. And here again, she sees Othello as an important public figure. She reminds us that he has a big job. And we see the goodness of her, the absolute goodness of her, as she tries to find an excuse for Othello's terrible behavior to her. And she says, nay, we must think men are not gods. So she's reminding herself that all men have defects, etc. However, her hamartia, and remember the word hamartia means wrong decision rather than fatal flaw. Her hamartia is to not see what is before her. She idolizes her husband. And even in this speech, she kind of blames herself, calling herself unhandsome warrior. Immediately the audience thinks back to that beautiful moment when Othello sees her in Cyprus and shouts, "Oh, my fair warrior." Really interesting term in which love and conflict are seen to have parallels. Anyway, she ends the speech by almost blaming herself for thinking bad thoughts about Othello. So we see her as absolutely selfless. Now, obviously, in Jacobean times, this may very well have been seen very differently from today. In Jacobean times, this kind of service to your husband would be commended. And today, in a feminist or post-feminist world, that certainly wouldn't be the case. And many members of the audience today find it very difficult to understand and forgive Othello, particularly because Desdemona's virtue causes us, the audience, so much pain, as we will see in the next act. Now, as I said a moment ago, the contrast between Emilia and Desdemona is remarkable, and it really does throw Desdemona's hamartia into relief. Notice here, Emilia says, "Pray heaven it be state matters as you think, and no conception nor no jealous toy." Now that's very worrying, isn't it? And notice that Desdemona recognizes that. She says, "Alas the day, I never gave him cause." This is the dawning awareness that Desdemona has that something is wrong, that her assessment of Othello's character might be not as accurate as she believed. Notice she does not deny what Emilia says. She almost confirms it, and she protests her innocence, and she will go to her deathbed believing that if she retains, that her innocence will protect her. Now we approach the end. As I said, Desdemona believes that her innocence will protect her. Emilia, on the other hand, realizes that jealousy is entirely irrational. She calls it a monster, and of course that reminds us of the haunting phrase, "the green-eyed monster that mocks the flesh upon which it feeds." Emilia understands how captivating jealousy is. And we're reminded that Iago, her husband, is obsessed by ideas of sexual betrayal. In Act 1, Scene 3, as early as that, he gives his suspicion that betwixt the sheets he has done my office. The he here is Othello. He fears that Othello's slept with his wife. Later, he fears Cassio with my nightcap. Again, both of these instances don't seem to be grounded in any kind of reality at all. So when Emilia speaks of jealousy, the audience are reminded of the kind of patriarchal fury and violence which can occur when men feel that they have been wronged. So it's a real warning. So briefly, in conclusion, in this scene, we see the virtue of Desdemona. We also see the fact that she is beginning to have an inkling of the danger that she is in, but it's not a full realization, and it won't be a full realization until she's on her deathbed. So as we approach the catastrophe, and the catastrophe in this case will be Desdemona's killing in her own bedroom in her wedding sheets, the catastrophe is heightened by the fact that Desdemona is such a remarkable and virtuous lady. And that is one of the reasons why this is such an effective scene in terms of establishing the final tragedy. Thank you.